monitor?
It's not too bad.
We're
going live right now. Oh, you know what I didn't do? I should record the Zoom as a backup. I'll do that in a minute. Live from Austin, Texas. It's the Plutopia live stream. We're missing Scoop tonight. He usually gives the introduction in his incredible radio voice, something that I lack. But I want to welcome everybody here. And I want to introduce, first off, our other not ready for prime time player here, Maggie Duvall. Scoop Sweeney could not be with us tonight. Susie Sheeler couldn't be with us tonight. So it's just us with our guest, Christopher Brown, who is an author and a lawyer based here in Austin, lives here with his family in the Edgeland Woods between the river and the factories, where he works in a 1978 Airstream trailer, which we can see right here behind. And he writes the urban nature newsletter Field Notes and is the subject of a just published article in Texas Monthly by Julie Poole about his Edgeland house. And I am going to make a backup recording of this conversation before we start. So here we are. And I want to really welcome you, Chris, because I haven't seen you in a long time. We've been hiding from COVID, I think, both of us.
Yeah, I missed being able to hang out. We were talking about planning going for a walk, a Field Notes style walk, maybe in the Southwest Austin woods where you live. But obviously then I don't remember if it was Delta or Omicron that hijacked our idea before we even had fixed a date. So we got to get that back on the calendar. But it's great to see you both. And thanks for having me on. Oh,
well, thanks for coming. I'm actually wanting to share this on the screen, which is the Texas Monthly article. Dystopian author Christopher Brown truly lives on the edge. That's a good headline. And it's talking about your home, the Edgeland house. So maybe that's something we should talk about first. You have a fairly unique house there. Of course, you're not in your house right now. You're in your Airstream trailer, which I guess is parked right outside. Is that it?
Yeah, I'm parked right out here by the street. I mean, yeah, Edgeland House is well, the name kind of describes it reasonably well, but essentially I don't know, it was 2009, I guess, kind of in the middle of the financial crisis. And at the time I was living downtown and was kind of a half-time single dad trying to figure out where I was going to plant more permanent roots. And I had been spending a lot of time doing a variety of sort of urban explorations, kind of a eco variation of psychogeography, you might say. A lot of finding the little weird pockets of woods and the paths you're not supposed to walk on. Some amount of trespassing involved, and then and I had also discovered the stretch of the Colorado River in East Austin that flows from Longhorn Dam east in the direction of Bastrop and the Gulf. And I remember I was driving on the Montopolis Bridge right after they moved the airport from the former location in Central Austin to the site of the old Air Force Base that got where they used to fly Strange Love ready B-52s over our southern neighbors from the so-called Roundagon that's now a Hilton Hotel. But anyway, driving to that new airport and looking down off the bridge and seeing what looked like some kind of intact stretch of river, or at least green. And so I went down there with my son, I don't know, a few weeks later, or after I had been noodling on it for a while. And we put a canoe in like on a Saturday morning, and it was absolutely like a stretch of, wild and scenic river like you might find in a
Wow.
national park, but like except with, jets flying over, jets here and herons there. And, we paddled a little bit, and there was like a hawk came in and like tried to take this duck out of the air right over our boat. And, we paddled all the way up to the dam, and it was just kind of an incredible thing to experience. And so I ended up starting to look around for property on the river, and I didn't even know that this particular area existed. But the lot I found was a kind of a quasi brownfield site. Brownfield being a term for pieces of land that have had some kind of toxic industrial use.
Like a dump, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
This site had an old petroleum pipeline running through it, and but it had been abandoned in place after neighborhood activists had gotten it shut down in the 90s. Got this big tank farm from which it originated shut down in the 90s. The folks at Poder, the East Austin environmental justice activists. So I was the beneficiary of their work, and I was able to get the pipeline taken out. And then I took this kind of funky industrial lot, found some architects, and who kind of got the crazy bunker post-apocalyptic lifestyle I was looking for.
And that was Bercy Chen, right?
Yeah, that was Bercy Chen Studios, Thomas Bercy and Calvin Chen, who were kind of the time were like very young and hungry, like early 30s architects. And I met Thomas through a mutual friend. We had each had a German friend who we ran into after we came and toured the lot. We ran into him at the grabbing beers after. And anyway, yeah, so they kind of collaborated with me on this idea of a house that essentially preserves the memory of the former industrial use where the pipeline was. That shot you were just showing, you can kind of see there's this sort of open patio, as it were, between the two halves of the house. And that basically follows the line where the pipeline was.
Wow.
And so, the idea of like preserving the memory of this former industrial use while at the same time trying to harmonize this abrupt and in some ways kind of violent transition between these light factories that are around here and that heavier history of abusive use of the land, and the little pockets of woods that are back and behind there along the floodplain of the river.
It's kind of a weird area. If you kind of drive down there and you're just kind of driving around, you think that you're in an area that's commercial, industrial, whatever. And then there's just this land out there. And of course, your house is kind of hidden from view back there. And I know there's several other people living back there. But, I could drive down that road and not even imagine that there's residences along the river there.
It's kind of near a major corridor through East Austin. It's kind of like, a few short steps from an on-ramp to a tollway.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, the historical zoning here was, I think, especially, in the 20th century Jim Crow era, this was kind of industrial downzoning over here. I think that also probably had to do with the Air Force Base. There was a lot of, awful lot of Quonset huts in our neighborhood, and so I think between, World War II and the 70s and kind of the end of the Vietnam War, I think this was pretty heavy for, business activities that related to the Air Force Base and things like that. And now we have a door factory and a dairy plant and we've got a lot of little like weird shops, one where they're currently like converting, doing a lot of like camper conversions. And we have the very groovy industrial use of a wind chime factory, where it's this very Austin kind of thing. It's the music of the spheres, the Stradivarius of wind chimes. That is their trademark slogan. Yeah. So,
okay. Wow.
And it was very funny. My my late uncle Fred, he was a vibraphonist, jazz vibraphonist, who played with Max Roach in his all percussion septet boom, and he gave us one of these as our wedding present, one of these from Music of the Spheres, and that he had one in his apartment on Riverside Avenue in Morningside Heights, not knowing that it was made like 3 doors down from our house. It's pretty groovy. There you go. Yeah, Music of the Spheres.
Oh, those are
Yeah.
great.
Great.
Yeah.
Little free advertising for those guys. They deserve it.
They do.
So do they, do you ever like cross paths with those guys?
With the
Not
wind
well, not
chime?
just the wind chime guys, but kind of the various people
Yeah,
who
I
have
mean,
businesses along there, the commercial.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you get to know them, get to know your neighbors. So, like, I mean, I know the guy that owns the door factory, and like a lot of the guys that work there, they kind of have like a Friday afternoon happy hour. And they have we also have, there's a Travis County housing facility, kind of like right across the street. So those folks are often hanging around, and a couple of those guys helped us on their weekends, helped us build this grotto we made in our backyard out of trash that had been dumped on mostly concrete debris, trash that had been dumped on the site over the years.
Do those other folks ever come kind of wandering around? Are you sort of like the only dedicated urban naturalist in the neighborhood?
No, like all my
people?
neighbors are here because they're like, oh wow, yeah. I mean, there are 3 couples on the street who are in the film business who, so they're just drawn by, the kind of the aesthetic beauty and the romance of the place. And a lot of them are also pretty serious outdoors people. We have like a guy who's an art director who's also a champion fly fisherman, and then a guy, a screenwriter and kind of a children's author who's same thing. He's a kind of, was like a, outward bound type. And the couple that I bought the lot from, they moved here in the late 90s and bought up really like a 6-acre parcel of this kind of blighted, riverfront land. And they're both PhD biologists. He's an entomologist and she's a botanist, and they met because the plants she was studying were being eaten by the bugs he studied. So
Wow, that's a story.
We have a neighbor who's one of the activists who helped shut down the tank farm, and was like a ballet dancer and multi-instrumental musician and holistic healer. And it's a very Austin collection of people. So, and we're all pretty lucky to be here. And y'all, go ahead.
Sorry.
I was just wondering.
Go
ahead.
No, that's okay.
Well, I was just curious how I think about, like with climate change, the South moving north, like an inch a year or whatever, with development in Austin. And the last time I was there, a few months back, I was shocked at how much development there is. Is it starting to encroach, and how quickly is it encroaching your direction?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's just, you just wonder, like, when how it feels like not an if but a when, but that there's suddenly some office tower or apartment complex looming over the house. But because we are on a pretty major, very close to a pretty major corridor. I mean, this rare thing we have here that we're lucky to live next to, of this stretch of urban river that's been basically like accidentally preserved to a large extent through this industrial zoning. The kind of the industrial land uses kind of fence off from the rest, kind of fence off this stretch of like a couple miles of woods along the river. And in the 80s, the city was pretty visionary about how they here you're going to show a map and point out exactly where we're at. But
Where are
No,
you?
it's
You're
cool.
kind of around here, aren't you?
No, I'm on the other side of the dam, but we don't need to get too specific here.
Oh,
But
way back here.
you know, something like that. But here's the river, uh, and so if you go back, you can see where Town Lake is, John. If you scroll back to the left a little bit, and there's the you know, you can see here's Town Lake, and here's the Colorado River stretching off to the right, and
Yeah,
and
Town
the
Lake, referred to as Lady Bird Lake here, much to her
yeah,
chagrin.
and you can see where the dam is there, where it says Longhorn Shores of Town Lake. So,
Yeah.
but you know, in 1985, I guess you were probably here, John. There was a big ruckus about the construction of the Hyatt Hotel at down there at Auditorium Shores,
Uh-huh.
which I guess was just green space before then. And I think that really caused a lot of provoked a lot of anger in the community that the city wasn't doing anything to protect the riverfront. So they put in place a development overlay all the way along the river within the city limits, basically up to 183 here to the east, where you see that Colorado River Park Wildlife Sanctuary.
Hey.
And
Yeah.
and so
Oh,
that's
there it
helped.
is.
It's kind of, so there's an overlay, you know, so one, you have the floodplain, which is undevelopable, and then there's an overlay in favor of the river. And they also banned mineral extraction, and said it could only be done on the east side of 183. So
Well, I wanted
that's
to make
why.
I was just going to say, I want to make a comment about this Roy Guerrero Park. I was there a few months ago on a mushroom walk, basically foraging for mushrooms with Sam, the fun guy. And he was talking about how most of the mushrooms here in this area, close to the Colorado River, kind of around the Guerrero Park, and I think kind of around here, just kind of right across from the wildlife sanctuary.
Yeah.
He said that most of the mushrooms there are inedible because there was so much industrial development there that I think that the mushrooms are absorbing a lot of like heavy metals, you know. Basically, even the edible mushrooms are toxic there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the board of directors of Ecology Action in Central Texas, which has and we have a site there kind of behind the Roy Guerrero.
Yeah, that's where we were
Colorado
actually.
River Park.
Yeah, we were at that site.
It's called Circle Acres, and it was for a while an official municipal landfill, and then like an outlaw landfill, and it has a landfill cap, and like we're not allowed to do controlled burns there for restoration because there's too much methane in the ground. So yeah, I think on the other side it's probably not quite as bad, and but you know, it's really funny. I mean, when I first started exploring this particular area, I started finding some amazing sites. Like in that Colorado River Preserve, there's this just beautiful wetland. And there used to be this, I think you had an image of this on the post for the show. There was this old like mid 60s Chevy Impala kind of sitting in this swamp. And I remember first discovering it and just being like blown away to see this kind of wrecked old muscle car, looked kind of like, you know, half Batmobile, and sitting in this just insanely gorgeous wetland. And I was sure like this is some like intact remnant of what it was like there before, you know, Anglo settlement. And then it took a while, and I did a little research, and then I found out like as recently as like the 40s, there was a road running through there. It's like a whole, like there's a bridge because they had a temporary bridge there for a while, and then a lot of these like trails now in Guerrero Park were part of this road system. And so it was actually and it had all been like a gravel pit after that up into the 70s and 80s, and all around. And so what it showed me was like, this is not some remnant, but this is like an example of just how resilient wild nature is if you just kind of leave it alone for a couple of decades, and how quickly things recover. And that was really a powerful thing to learn.
So when your house was built, there was some involvement of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, which is actually how here, kind of more in this part of town. But they came down there, and did they help sort of figure out what to plant, like on the roof of your house?
Yeah, well, what they had the Percy Chen guys had the idea of a green roof, and I had wanted that kind of like the idea, that idea of a house that's almost like a overgrown, a building you find in the, an abandoned building you find in the woods that's kind of overgrown. And I had done some restoration work in the Midwest where I'm from, but while I was working on the project, I met my now wife, Augustina Rodriguez, and she was had a design studio down the street, and one of her partners was a guy named John Hart Asher, who was a landscape architect who at the time was at the Wildflower Center working in their eco design group with a guy named Mark Simmons, who was an English ecologist who sadly passed away a few years after we finished the project prematurely. But anyway, they had spent 10 years Mark had really figuring out how to as a landscape ecology project, how to have green roofs survive in the extreme hot, dry climate of Texas, because most green roof precedents out there really were from a Northern European kind of milieu, where they'd use these kind of turfy, basic grasses that are evolved to withstand these very wintry and wet climates, right? And sort of easy to keep them wet because it's like always raining. And the trick with the green roof is you got to kind of keep it alive to some extent for it to really fully do its work. And so they were like, well, the way to do it in Texas is you just recreate the prairie on these green roofs, right? And that to me just resonated as sort of intuitively right. And even as I'm not as immediately persuaded that that the decisions that are made about what is deemed a native species and what is deemed an invasive species, I'm not as persuaded that that's as easy to do as a lot of more informed authorities might suggest. But I did know from like restoration work my folks had done on a bigger site in Iowa, on a rural site, that you just see you bring back biodiverse native plantscapes, and the other biodiversity that comes with it is just like amazing. And you just, whether you do it through burning or through planting or whatever, you bring back, 70 native species sharing a spot, and that brings the bugs, and the bugs bring the lizards and the birds, and so on up the food chain. And that's really proved true here. So we have this little crazy green roof, and it has really proven exceptionally effective to kind of realize this experiment we had in mind in feral living.
You feel that you've been able to create a fairly balanced ecology there, with the modifications that you've made, like putting in the house and the parts that you've built into and around the house.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not kind of full of myself about it, but I think that in like lots of different levels, it's been more effective that way than I had thought, and having coral snakes show up at your bedroom door on autumn nights or early summer nights might not necessarily be everybody's idea of the kind of home decor they had in mind. But I was like, that's a victory condition. And the coral snakes come up because there are all these lizards that are coming out to eat the bugs that are majorly turned, using the roof, the green roof as a habitat. And the lizards kind of hide under the eaves of the windows along the and wait for the bugs to come out, and the snakes come up to get them. And I mean, we have some of the things I've been writing about in the field notes recently. I mean, like we have all these songbirds come in and nest in the crossvine that hangs down from the windows. Often, using materials like as insulation, that they like industrial materials they salvage from the trash bins of the factories next door, bits of like foam core insulation and, plastic bags and wet paper and whatever. And
what are some of the birds that show up?
Well, I mean, we get all kinds of them. We've had like, golden cheeked warblers, even, the like super rare stuff. I mean, the kind of basic birds like cardinals are the ones that are the really active, like Anthropocene nesters. But we get all manner of, often rare songbirds. This time of year is when we get just not super rare, but we get these big flocks of cedar waxwings come through.
Yeah.
They should be here any day.
Right.
And they love the hackberry trees, those hackberry trees, which are kind of the arborists often kind of speak ill of the hackberries, but I think at least in this stretch where it's very wet, the hackberries do really well, and they grow really tall, and they just provide incredible amounts of food for songbirds in winter that sort of sticks on the trees, because I don't think there are a lot of other animals eating them, and they come through and they just fill up the trees, and then they bathe on our crazy pool that Augustina designed, and it's pretty remarkable. And then we have a ton of, this is heavy kind of raptor territory because of the, those riparian woods.
Right.
And so we have there's a lot of red-shouldered hawks, which is a hawk that particularly likes areas where there's where you kind of have a wooded area that's near water and or near fields where they can hunt, and they're really good. They can like hunt in the forest. Osprey on the river, which is a pretty cool thing, and caracara, the northern crested caracara, which is kind of many people think is that it's what the eagle on the Mexican flag actually is. Mm-hmm. And then barred owls. Right now, the barred owls have been calling at night, and that's just a beautiful bird. And then I was just down there in the Colorado River Preserve yesterday morning on a run, and I saw this lady out birding, and she said somebody has seen a snowy owl in there in the last week. So it's like that. So if I see like a white owl, I'm just gonna like go full Gandalf. I think I'll just have to.
Have you found any artifacts from ancient inhabitants of the area?
Oh yeah, you do. I mean, it depends on your definition of ancient. I mean, we found Neolithic stone tools. I mean, the river is kind of constantly like churning new stuff up, especially after major floods. And you'll see, like, after there's a big flood, the super fossil nerds show up, the arrowhead, arrowhead foragers, and they'll be out there picking through the new rocks. But we took a bunch of these things. You can kind of tell these things from how they hold in your hand usually, when they're like really, early stone tools. And I don't know if they're still doing it, but it used to be that at the Texas Memorial Museum at the UT campus, they would have identification day pre-COVID,
really?
where you could go in and bring in whatever weird natural history object you found, and they'll identify it. And so we had one thing, they were like, yeah, that's like at least 5,000 years old. And we had our neighbor had a thing that they identified as a clear fork gouge that she had found down here by the river. And that's like 10 to 12,000 years old.
Wow.
And you'll find this used to be kind of right outside the city limits. And I think it was just like a major trash dump. So you'll find lots of kind of 19th century, like broken china, fragments of china and medical glass from, apothecary glass and it's all these kind of funky colors. And then, there's just lots of more like 20th century trash, and to me those can be equally amusing. I mean, I have a terrarium full of like strange little objects from a Camp David cufflink that one of my neighbors says there's this abandoned novelty lighting factory down the street, And apparently when W was president, it was used as a Secret Service staging area, kind of conveniently halfway between downtown and the airport. And
Wow.
I was doing yard work one time, and this our street's kind of a place for people to sort of park and party, a kind of a lover's lane at the edge of town. And I found this broken can of something called Mr. Prolong, which was looked like those cans of Binaco Blast, but it was like a topical anesthetic to prolong the act of love or something. But the tagline was.
Wow.
And you find lots of animal bones and other kinds of like tracker sign, like you'll find like I meant to have like a little piece of a foxtail, and you're just like, you'll find it on the trail and you'll wonder what it is. And lots of antlers and strange little skulls and tiny bones and big bones. And sometimes in the river you'll find like big fossilized bones that I think are usually of bovines of various sorts. But yeah, I mean, there's just there are all these stories around you, and when you find these older things, it really connects you to kind of deep time in a way that it sort of, and you're just like walking along a river, and it's like, wait, they're like, it looks like a scene from it looks like you could be miles from anywhere, but then there's like suddenly you hear the cars or the police sirens, or you notice the skyscraper rising up over the trees or whatever, and there's a kind of a dissonance there that's kind of awesome.
Right. It's like I always like thinking about how it feels like the veil of time is really thin, right, when you're in those areas. And and I remember I went out to an event, a fundraising event, a number of years ago out at Spiderwood Studios out in Utley, and I was completely intrigued because Tommy told us about when they were, building one of those sound stages or something, they unearthed a Union Army encampment. And I was like, what?
Wow.
Really? That's really cool. Yeah, because when they were trying to block the cotton trade down the Colorado River, because I guess Bastrop was a terminus to send it to the Gulf or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally.
I really love these.
A lot of,
I was just gonna say, I really love these images that you sort of plug into field notes.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I mean, this format, I think, sort of suits the material, and I've been having kind of more fun than I would have expected with this particular project, of doing this as a weekly newsletter. Oh, you hear the bird nests, right? So,
So how did you get started? I mean, what made you decide you wanted to like make this into a blog and a regular thing?
Yeah, well, I have been, I've been doing this kind of exploring really like my whole life since I was a little kid. And like I grew up on my first memories are like of living on this kind of mid 20th century neighborhood where we were in the Midwest, where I remember walking across the street and there were these woods, and then they were building the first freeway through town by those woods. And when I moved over, and I had written, little bits and pieces here, like on old blogs I was on about some of these kinds of little jaunts. And then after we built the house and moved in over here, and that was really becoming like a daily practice, I was accumulating just like a ton of material and really learning a lot of things about a lot of things. And so I would occasionally do like a little like Tumblr, like kind of weird Ballardian journal entry about it when Tumblr was a thing, 10 years ago. And then after I finished my most recent novel, Failed State, like right after I turned it in, I was like, I'm going to try doing a newsletter. I was really intrigued by the newsletter format. I always loved newsletters. Like, my dad would get like the Kiplinger report, like this dorky, like, investor guy for guys who want to be investor guys, kind of newsletter, or like tax advice for, 70s and 80s, tax shelter nerds. and I used to, I used to be like in college, I wrote like a column for the school paper, and I've always liked that kind of like, there's something about that particular form that I think is interesting. And I'd been thinking about it a lot. And I was like, oh, that kind of suits this material, because, the idea of nature writing is very often done like the natural scientist's journal, the field notes, the field observations. And I'm also very interested in stuff like, and like the sort of the English writers who were, what you might call the psychogeographers school of kind of writing about walks, but they're always very urban. It's like, Ian Sinclair or J.G. Ballard stories that do it through fiction. Will Self, these kind of people, they would be writing about, kind of curious things you find wandering the urban setting. So adapting that to this more like slightly more wild and feral and weird and uniquely American landscape seemed like a lot of fun. And there also were this, there was also a school of English nature writing that's focused on these kinds of spaces. There's a living writer named Richard Mabey who he wrote a 60s book called, his first book was Food for Free, that's a real hippie kind of a book title. You know what the book's about from the title, right? And then he wrote a book called The Undiscovered Countryside, where he just documented the natural bounty of sort of exurban London, right? And then these writers, these poets, Paul Farley and Michael Simmons Roberts, wrote this book called Edgelands in 2011. That's where I got the idea for the name of this house. I read that book while I was on vacation over there with my son, and they talked about it in a very English landscape of like, growing up in a factory, in an industrial town. And it's kind of like the places they would play as kids around the factory. So anyway, so yeah, it's just like, oh, I'm going to start doing a weekly newsletter and just start putting this material to work. And instead of just like sharing it on Instagram or whatever, make something a little more meaningful with it. And I started it, so like in February 2020, right after I turned in the final revisions to Failed State, like I said, and then COVID happened, and like 3 weeks into it, and I think that it helped it kind of find a readership, because I think it was I don't know, I think it was sort of well tuned into the zeitgeist in some kind of funny way. And I had been, I had putting a lot of this kind of material into my novels, but doing it in a way that is more just like a journal of one's own sort of little ramblings. It's very different. And it's a kind of, to me, one of the things I don't like about fiction as a form, this is less of a problem with science fiction, but is that it's this singular preoccupation with the self and with the self-absorption of the human self. And it's all about, occupying a human point of view. And so nature writing is really intriguing in the way that certain science fictions are intriguing, because you can kind of get out of that, like a kind of a writing that's on the one hand, like from one person's point of view, but it's working on transcending that preoccupation with the self that kind of drives me crazy in a way. And so that was another kind of aspect of it that was pretty fun.
Well, and I'm now I'm intrigued because I've been under a rock. Actually, I've been working on some other stuff, so I haven't been paying attention. But now I'm going to read your newsletter, because I read a lot of nonfiction, and I read a lot of nature writing, and I like I was thinking, I love the work of Robert McFarlane, British Underland, and all that. And then I'm reading a book right now called Wrench from the Land. It's a series of interviews with writers who have been inspired by Edward Abbey. So
I saw that. Yeah,
it's really good. Yeah, and I love that kind of, that's my focus now, especially now that I'm in Taos. But everywhere I've lived, I've made it a point to sort of sink myself into the sense of place and
Right.
learn everything I can about. I'm just fascinated by like who was here before, like what's going on here, what are all the layers and levels. So yeah.
Totally. Yeah. And doing those kinds of investigations is tremendously rewarding, and the different ways in which you can go about making those kinds of discoveries and or just learn things that other people around you already know, but you just figured out or whatever. It's
Like,
pretty awesome.
yeah.
Yeah.
This was making me think about this documentary that I saw called The World Before Your Feet. Have you seen that?
No, I have not.
It's about a guy who walks, he makes it a project to walk every street in New York City. So he just sets out and starts walking street after street after street. And a documentary filmmaker went along with him and shot some of that.
That sounds really cool. Yeah, I mean,
it wasn't really naturalism, you know. I mean, it's a completely urban environment, but it's kind of fascinating, you know, and just this idea of sort of getting out in the world and seeing what's there, you know.
Yeah,
and you made a good point about getting out of yourself too.
Yeah, I think that a kind of honest depiction of the observed world in a way that has enabled some kind of fresh point of view on it by applying a particular prism. My editor at Harper, who edited my last 3 novels, he called it just what I was doing in the field notes. He called it dystopian nature writing, which I thought was about right. And I don't know if it's quite as grim as that sounds, but sort of like looking and so, you know, and Maggie, you talk about Robert McFarlane, whose work is just amazing. The way he writes with this kind of supported by like omnivorous lexicographical genius, right? And just like the language that he's able to like charge his work with. But so much nature writing is just like most nature writing is really focused on, like, especially American nature writing is focused on like the idea of like the remaining wilderness, you know, like the intact natural areas, right?
Right.
I just so that's what's fun about this is like now I'm just gonna go like, I mean, like today I was thinking about this. Today I went and I walked around like a tiny little pocket park that's left between like 2 buildings around the Saltillo Plaza development in East Austin, and just trying to see kind of what's left that can survive in this little pocket and what like tiny kernels of natural wonder might be lurking there. I think that and I think when, you know, in the American context, one of the things that I have come to believe, and as is evidence when you do these kinds of like prairie restoration projects, is that compared to England or Britain or Europe or really anywhere else outside of the Western Hemisphere, the conquest and raising and like subjugation to agriculture and urban development of the American landscape is really very recent in any kind of like grand scheme of things, or in any kind of, you know, sense of time that nature, you know, thinks about. And you realize like how easy it is for these things to come back, that like when people go and buy an acreage and they start burning it, these plants that everybody thinks are long gone, they just like come up out of the ground.
Right.
They're just like, it's there. And it's like Texas, you walk along any roadway where there's any kind of right of way that's green, if they let it, you know, go unmowed for a few days or weeks, the wildflowers start coming up out of it. And so
absolutely.
Trying to kind of like document that and see that it's like the French, the May 68, you know, French situationists and revolutionaries had that saying, you know, sous le pavé la plage, that like the beach was under the paving stones. And I like to say like sous le pavé la forêt, like there's, you know, wilderness right there kind of under the pavement if you just pay attention to it.
I've been thinking a bit about the relationship. I guess the difference in the relationship to land as property versus relationship to land as well, kind of the way the indigenous people related to the land, not as property, but as
It's
a
kind of
source,
commons,
basically.
or
Yeah.
well, yeah, or as, I mean, I don't presume to be able to speak for that point of view, but from things I read or from people I talk to who are more authoritative on such matters, I mean, the idea of not really having a sense of dominion over the rest of the environment, whether it's the land itself or the other species that occupy it, and thinking of all of that as a community, a biodiverse community of which we are a part, and recognizing the life force, in all of those things, even the supposedly inorganic or inanimate things.
Yeah. How can you own all these other life forms? How can you own them? How could they be your property?
Right. And that idea, like in my novel Rule of Capture, I mean, I try to dig into all of it, and in Failed State, try to dig into those ideas, kind of like the interrogation of the legal regimes that govern these things. I mean, I mean, the philosophical underpinnings of property law are pretty easy to shred, with any kind of honest examination. And so, yeah, and I try to, play with some of those ideas in these little journal entries as well.
Yeah, there's a sense in the kind of more capitalist framework that if you don't figure out how to exploit the land, then you have no right to own it, to claim a property right to it. You claim a property right based on your willingness to exploit and sort of conquer and subjugate the land. And this is versus the idea of the indigenous foragers who lived off the land, but they didn't really try to dominate the land. They lived in more in harmony with it. I picked up some of this from reading, The Dawn of Everything, which is kind of a hot book right now. And it kind of gets into this stuff. There's some question about the complete accuracy of the book, but it really basically says that, the lenses that we have for seeing the world are sort of Western capitalist lenses, and this sort of proprietarian mentality that is not really the only way to think of the world, and not the only way to think of your life in the world. And I hadn't really thought about that before. I mean, I just sort of took everything for granted. Property. Yeah. People, you buy a house and you own the house, and you've got the land under the house, and you've got all the trees, and if an animal wanders onto the land, they're on your land. We don't have to really think of it that way.
Well, no, and if you really do a deep interrogation of it, you come to realize that all of that is really the system that is intended to enslave you to, the alienated condition of your labor, so that your mortgage payment and is there to keep you on the treadmill of capitalism, and all that's really rooted in the systems of grain agriculture that were invented at the dawn of the agricultural revolution. And I mean, I read this pretty incredible book a few years ago called Against the Grain by James Scott, who's this kind of very interesting emeritus professor at Yale, basically an anthropologist. And it's, he does a deep history of the early estates, and how, contrary to the kind of what you learned in middle school social studies class or whatever, about how civilization starts with the agricultural revolution, which is what made everybody happy. There's a pretty good argument to be made that actually the so-called primitive peoples, as they used to speak of them back then, when I was a kid at least, people who were living as hunters and gatherers, were much happier and had, maybe they didn't have quite the same lifespans or whatever, but they had, they weren't chained to offices looking at computers, and they weren't, as was the case with these early estates. As soon as you introduce accumulations of surplus that have value to the community as food or as whatever, or as a thing that can be used as a medium of exchange, you start having people fight over it. And then they would, people would be like enslaving their neighbors to go work the fields or whatever. And so I think all of those, I don't know, all of those property regimes are all tied up in those systems, which are, all the roots of our, our current kind of climate crisis. And I don't know, one of the things I learned kind of living around here and kind of better understanding the social context of this ecological space that I was wandering through was that most of our social and economic and other injustices that kind of dominate the headlines are really rooted in the damaged relationship we have with the land on which we live, all of which is tied up in, John, that idea of property rights that you're talking about.
Yeah, and
Not
I don't
to
think
suggest I have the alternative, but
well, I was going to say I don't think the solution to this is in politics. I think the solution is probably in catastrophe.
Well, that may be, yeah.
Something has to hit us really hard.
Yeah, or an individual or a small community action to kind of like reorganize the way we approach how we live. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I think you're right about that. I mean, the histories of circumstances in which there's been kind of major change on these issues, it's like war, famine, natural disaster, or or some kind of massive economic depression.
I'm watching Maggie adjust her camera.
My cat.
She just had to flash her Cafe Armageddon sticker on the back of her laptop.
That's right.
I was kind of flashing back to Failed State right then, and you really in that you're sort of, I guess you consider that a trilogy in those books. You really address the politics of this, and you address the corruption, of the politics du jour, I guess.
Yeah, I try to engage in that, and I mean, and I don't, like I said, I don't know that I have all the answers, but I think to get there, I really think you got to do a much deeper interrogation than we tend to do. I mean, I was just listening to an interview by this writer, David Kubrin, I believe is his last name. He's a historian of science, and he has this book that came out from PM Press last year called Marxism and Witchcraft, which I have right back here. But and basically the thesis is that the sort of mechanistic thinking that came about with the Enlightenment and with Newton and other kind of early natural scientists contributed to like a fundamental failing of Marxist thinking and other kind of left thinking, that they're too divorced from nature to really be able to come up with an effective radical critique and or certainly an effective utopian prescription for how we could do better. And he talks about how something that I guess has been widely understood in recent decades, that like Newton also was an alchemist, and how we have to kind of revive these theories. But the problem with it is he thinks that these problems started, in the 17th century, and it's like now you got to like go back to like 5000 BC or 10, to the kind of origins of agriculture or deeper to really understand the kind of where that starts to go astray, I think.
Yeah, I never can decide whether it's best to sort of dig back and get into the history and try to piece it all together and to come up with, sort of explore the philosophical evolution of the human race and that sort of thing, or whether we need to just sort of like toss all that aside and start all over again, kind of wipe the plate clean and try to create a new way of thinking about things. But the problem is that we're so embedded in the reality we're in now. It's really hard to just, you can't really divorce yourself from your cultural roots and from.
Well, right. It's like the Frederick Jameson, the kind of overquoted aphorism that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, or easier to imagine the end of the world than a small change in the political system. And there's some truth to that. I think, I read a lot of like eco fiction, ecologies of a kind of climate future in the past year or two, and it's interesting in that like nobody can really, or maybe everybody's kind of afraid, but nobody really like stares in the face of like the next century.
Right.
It's kind of like, unless it's like Kim Stanley Robinson or somebody who's just got this kind of like sense of duty of just kind of showing how it's going to be, and the sober one. People have to flash forward to sort of, okay, what could be like, what good could we get to, 1,000 years after what's coming? Gibson does an interesting thing with in the last two novels, The Peripheral and Agency, with the idea of the jackpot and this like, there's the multi-factor climate-focused apocalypse in the second half of the 21st century, and then the people that survive have it really sweet on the other side. But a lot of these other things, there's like, it's kind of like imagining a future race of humans evolved into kind of like, nomadic elves or something, roaming a post-apocalyptic, post-industrial wonderland. I think that we underestimate the possibilities that are there, and just these little projects like we've done of kind of trying to rewild the environment around you, or just discover the wild that's already there around you, and kind of like see it and build your relationship with it. To your point, John, about talking about like, the way that, one is, reading on it, you're taught to think that maybe a lot of Native American populations lived in a better sense of harmony and understanding with their animal and plant neighbors. And I think there are a lot of things we can do that way. And, like letting your yard go wild and finding Chile Pekin growing there, these like little pea-sized peppers, and then like learning that like that's like the pepper of the Americas, the wild food that can only be germinated through the digestive system of a bird,
Right.
and that from which apparently like all the other peppers in the American table were derived through human manipulation, right? Learning how to like just kind of getting in touch with with these ways of experiencing the wild around you, even in the most urban of settings, and thinking about how to kind of rewild yourself, even if you still have to have a job and kind of participate in the system. But you can start to see kind of windows out of it. And I don't know, I think that there's more potential there than maybe we tend to assume. And I think things like the experience of pandemic and seeing how, these systems of like economic control over our lives that are so against nature, that we're all so habituated to and trained to endure, how quickly those can be suspended, right? Just like not having to go to the office and participate in the like primate FaceTime games and, power pyramids and whatever. They're all about like controlling labor and the surplus. And
right.
We probably just need a re-enchantment, like Morris Berman said, the re-enchantment of the world. But we have we're kind of at the end of our hour, and I can't believe it. We could just do this all night. This was great, Chris.
Talking to you guys. Thank you, John.
Really appreciate you coming and joining us. Do you have another book in the works? Like a novel?
I have a novel I'm working on. The working title is Controlled Burn, which is a kind of a novel of catastrophe, kind of about some young Texans enduring the aftermath of when the grid fails and never comes back on, and kind of playing with that cozy catastrophe idea. And then I'm working on a proposal right now for a nonfiction, kind of creative nonfiction book. That's like a book version of Field Notes. So I'm hoping to see.
I'm waiting for the documentary. I'm ready for somebody to follow you around with a camera.
Yeah. So when you publish Field Notes, you have to do a book tour, and we'll set you up in Taos. That'd be great.
All right. That sounds awesome. Right on.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much.
Thanks,
we
you
will
guys.
see you soon. See you face to face soon. We'll take that walk.
All right. Sounds good. Have a good
Okay.
Have a
evening.
good one. Bye.
Adios.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.